A festive mood in the Republic of South Sudan as it becomes the world's newest nation. But what of the challenges after the celebrations? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. 6 years after a peace agreement ended decades of war, the Republic of South Sudan has been officially born. On Saturday, thousands gathered to watch South Sudan take its independence, splitting from the north and dividing what was Africa's largest country. African leaders and officials from around the world attended the ceremony, which marked the creation of the planet's newest state. The independence follows a referendum in January this year, when 98% of South Sudanese voted in favor of statehood. The referendum, in turn, following a peace deal that ended a bitter and lengthy civil war between the North and South. But South Sudan remains chronically underdeveloped, and as the excitement of independence dies down, the reality remains that this newly formed nation has been plunged into a new era of uncertainty. But the first president of South Sudan is optimistic. He's offered amnesty to those who fought against his government and has vowed to bring peace to troubled areas.
As we celebrate our freedom and independence today, I want to assure the people of Abyei, Darfur, Blue Nile, and South Kordofan that we have not forgotten you. When you cry, we cry. When you bleed, we also bleed. I pledge to you today that we will find a just peace for all. I will work with my brother, President al-Bashir, and the international community to find a just and lasting peace.
For more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. In London, Richard Dowden, the director of the Royal Africa Society. From Washington, D.C., Jackie Wilson, a senior program officer in the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peacebuilding at the United States Institute of Peace. And joining us via broadband from Amsterdam, Egbert Wesselink, director of European Coalition on Oil in Sudan. That's a corporation of 50 NGOs and human rights organizations that aim to generate peace and stability through Sudan's oil wealth. Welcome to you all. Let's begin in Washington with Jackie Wilson. In a week's time, the UN will formally recognize South Sudan. Its flag will be hoisted along First Avenue in New York. But is it really ready for recognition as a functioning state?
There are many challenges that need to be overcome in southern Sudan, excuse me, or the Republic of South Sudan. But the 6-year interim period after which the comprehensive peace agreement was signed really allowed for development of much of the governmental infrastructure in Sudan that is needed to create a functioning state. So there are ministries, there are state legislative assemblies that have been elected. Below that level, there are some appointed officials, and some of these ministries may have offices with desks with nothing on them. So that gives you a sense of some of the challenges that need to be overcome. But there have been a lot of strides made. And so I think for the birth of a new country, they're actually in a relatively good state of affairs right now.
Egbert Wesselink in Amsterdam, your view on this, is it ready for recognition?
Yes, I think so. And I certainly think that they have the right. We have seen now the end of one of many Sudan's civil wars. It's been so terrible. And I think we cannot expect peace in Sudan without independence of the South. There would be war if they would not, if they would have to stay together. One of the challenges, of course, to keep this government government ministries, etc., that have been built up functioning. For that, one needs money. 98% of the income of the government of South Sudan is from the oil. And we've last week heard al-Bashir threaten to cut the oil pipelines if the South would not give the North a big share of the oil revenues. And the South has said no. And that is really a poker game at the moment that I would say even in 1-2 years' time may, unless it stabilizes really dramatically, could seriously jeopardize the potential of the South to actually govern itself.
We'll return to the specific issue of oil in a minute, but for the moment, Richard Dowden in London, we've heard that there are ministries in place. There might not be material on the desks, but it certainly has the appearance of a functioning state. Would you agree?
Not really. The act of independence itself seems totally justified. If you've been in the north, you know how Southerners are treated there, and this war to oppress them justified independence completely. Having said that, I mean, it has been described as a pre-failed state, and I think that could accurately sum it up, because there's not even a road, a hard-top road from the capital to a border. There's still just a dirt road. And that's in the terms of the infrastructure. There's just very little. You've got, 80-something%, 80 to 90% illiteracy. You've got a leadership that is primarily military, not political. So I just think, in so many ways, it just is not a state, and it's not a nation state either. There is no such thing as a Southern Sudanese is a label, but it's not a nationality, because these people have never met each other. Because of the civil war, there are something like the ethnic groups, and there are up to about 100 of them, have never really engaged with each other. So there's no great sense of being Southern Sudanese, which I would have said is a prerequisite for a state to exist.
Well, clearly we've already headlined some of the many issues and challenges that we will discuss, but Al Jazeera's Harun Mutasa has been watching the celebrations in Juba, and now she looks at the challenges of nation building that lie ahead.
Unlike most African countries that inherited some kind of infrastructure after their independence, officials in Khartoum never really invested in the South. Getting basic services to people who've known more than 20 years of civil war is a priority. Creating democratic government institutions is also crucial. For the past 6 years, the government here has been functioning semi-autonomously. So South Sudan isn't exactly starting from scratch. It has its own judiciary and an elected National Assembly. After the 9th of July, a transitional constitution comes into effect, but that's already causing friction. Critics fear the current document gives too much power to the president and the ruling party, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, or SPLM.
When you have the president with more power, it is a dictatorship. SPLA was fighting for a democratic transformation in the Sudan. Now, if they are the one in power, how can they not practice democracy? They want to control power again. Then this thing become unacceptable.
Some want a federal government system, others a more centralized one. There is also concern the political elite will favor dominant ethnic groups and tribes. Insecurity along the north-south border, South Kordofan and Abyei, has displaced thousands of people. Issues such as oil sharing and border demarcation are still unresolved between the north and south. For people here, getting independence is only the beginning. Harun Mutasa, Al Jazeera, Juba.
Richard Dowden, you mentioned there the issue that nobody recognizes themselves as South Sudanese, that very critical point of nation building. Do you think it's possible to get to that point quickly, that you will have that kind of self-recognition which is so important at this stage?
Only, I think, if everybody's allowed to feel involved. But my experience on the ground with the SPLM leadership is that they are, we are the fighters, we are the ones who've liberated this, and therefore we hold the power. And they don't seem, and this is purely anecdotal from my point of view, they don't seem to have a very democratic mentality. Very different, say, from the Eritreans when they were fighting for independence, for example, which seemed to be a very democratic movement, and to a lesser extent the Tigrayans in Ethiopia. These are the other movements that I've known where there is a genuine sense of everybody being involved. I don't sense that with Sudan, particularly with peoples who are not from the three big groups, the Shilluk, the Dinka, and the Nuer. The other ones are really regarded as pretty marginal.
Well, Jackie Wilson, we are talking now about the internal problems being faced. We'll get to the external issues with the North shortly, but These internal problems that Richard has been discussing, how much of a stumbling block are they to the development of the society?
There is no doubt that these are large stumbling blocks, and he makes some very valid points, but some other considerations include the fact that so many Southern Sudanese were displaced during the Civil War, and many of those have returned. And those who have returned, in terms of identity, many of them are Arabic speakers, many of them were in camps in Kenya and Uganda. A number of diaspora people from Europe, America, from Australia have returned to help rebuild the South. And so the power dynamics are really very, very different, I think, than they were during the Civil War. Not to say that the military leadership is not still at the fore, but there is potential for that to change. The other element, which I think is important, is the presence of a very robust and growing active civil society. And that means that there are people who are actively challenging the process of developing a more transparent and inclusive constitution, discussing issues of federalism and distribution of power. And so I think that the presence of these diverse groups and civil society actually bode well for the transformation that does need to happen in South Sudan.
Egbert Wesselink in Amsterdam, you've already brought up that issue of oil. Now, this is expected to be a mainstay of the economy of the new republic, but how much of a potential problem is it, particularly, as you mentioned, in regard to its relations with the North?
Well, the North faces much more acute problems than the South in a way. The North has a big state revenue, and the Northern, the NCP that governs the North, depends largely on its security apparatus and on its patronage system to remain in power. Now, they will see a revenue cut of at least a third if the South becomes independent. Well, as of today, that is in fact. And that will put enormous stress on their ability to maintain their patronage structure. We've already seen acute economic signs of distress in the North with 12% inflation, food prices going up, and there's real fear of, Arab Spring kind of revolt in the streets. So food prices going up is the most sure sign of popular insatisfaction. And so that's why the North put so much pressure on the South. I've heard some senior people in the Southern Ministry of Energy and Mining say that, if the North wants from us, demands too much sharing of our revenues from us, we'll say no and let them cut the pipelines. That will, we can survive. We are very, very poor. 80% of our people are on subsistence anyway. And then you shouldn't forget, the South Sudan has never been governed. 80% of the population has never experienced government, and I don't think that will change very much. So many people in the South say we can deal with very little money. We've done that for so many years, and then let them have the problem. And that gives us the opportunity, meanwhile, to build a pipeline to Kenya and to become truly independent from these northern neighbors with whom we don't believe we will have an amicable relationship for many years to come anyway.
But this would take time, and to go to Richard Dowden in London, most of the oil is produced in the south, as we know, but the pipelines go out through the north. So clearly there is leverage that at this stage the north can bring to bear. But a country being launched with no agreement on something as important as this oil sharing partnership, how much of an issue is this in the weeks ahead, do you believe?
I think this is critical. I mean, here they are, independent, no deal on the oil. The North has got the tap and can just turn it off if it wants to, or they can just send it out and not send the checks. So, I mean, they've got a lot of room for putting pressure on the South. And the idea that somebody's going to build a commercial pipeline right across through the Rift Valley, across Kenya to the coast, I think is a bit unrealistic. I mean, it would be very vulnerable. It's got to be a huge logistical problem. And they say the oil anyway is going to only last till about 2020. So I'd love to know Egbert's view on this, of whether he really thinks that somebody is going to actually build that. Of course, the other point is that a lot of the oil is for China, And I think this means that the Chinese will be very keen to have it, and they could apply quite a lot of pressure to both sides to make sure that it happens.
Well, Egbert Wesseling, to bounce back to you, who do you think is going to build that pipeline?
I don't know, and I agree that economically it doesn't make sense. But if politically it doesn't work out and it doesn't make sense to continue using the oil infrastructure in the north, then there is no alternative. And building such a pipeline would cost $1.5–2 billion US dollars. Of course, there are challenges, but I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of kilometers of pipelines in the world through the Arctic, through anywhere. I mean, it can be built. It's a matter of political will. And of course, South Sudan will have to take hefty loans on future production in order to be able to finance it.
Well, the oil is just one of the major issues of dispute coming up. The other, of course, Jackie Wilson in Washington, will be borders. Already we've seen this year alone immense conflict still continuing in border areas such as South Kordofan or, in fact, Abyei. How much of a problem is this? Once again, there is no agreement yet on borders, despite the fact that you have independence declared in this country.
Well, like the situation with the negotiation over distribution of oil revenues and fees for use of pipelines, border demarcation is an issue that can be determined based upon political will. There are disputes, as we saw with Abyei, on exactly where the boundaries lie, exactly where certain peoples lived in the past. And despite international arbitration, the outcome is still not fully accepted and implemented, certainly not implemented. So there are a number of disputes along the border, probably about 5, that are considered especially problematic. But again, with political will, those borders can be demarcated by including the participation of the local communities that live in those areas, by producing demilitarized zones, and what some have called something like a soft border initiative, where you take the pressure off of the actual demarcation of the border and allow space, such as for movement of pastoralist communities that graze between north and south in those areas. So again, I think it gets back to the political will on the part of both parties to find a solution that's mutually acceptable and a nonviolent solution.
But in the end as well, there needs to be some form of policing. Clearly, the UN has renewed its mandate for peacekeeping forces within the Republic. But Richard Dowden, this type of UN policing, we have as well the mention of 4,200 Ethiopian troops in a border area. Is this going to work? Is this going to actually hold everything together while those political discussions that Jackie referred to continue?
I don't think so. Where you've seen UN troops in Sudan so far, they've not really had either logistical means nor the determination to actually protect civilians. There's been report after report of civilians supposedly under UN protection being attacked. And I just don't think with the northern NCP, the ruling party, that government has any interest in really bringing peace and a nice solution. On the contrary, I mean, their tactics seem to be to attack. Where there's a problem, you attack it. You send in the troops. That's exactly what they've done in Abyei, driving out the southerners, and the same in the Nuba Mountains, bombing the civilians there. That's their way of dealing with political problems. They did it in Darfur, they're doing it in Abyei, and they're doing it in the Nuba Mountains. That's the way they operate. That's what they do. They don't do nice, peaceful agreements with 50-50 sharing, unless they're absolutely forced to.
Jackie Wilson, your response to that?
No, I agree completely in terms of looking at the historical, evidence, right? This has been the tactic of the NCP government, but it doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. And what I mean by that is that there are still many Sudanese, northern and southern, who believe that it's possible to have a Sudan with tolerance, diversity, human dignity, human rights. And we have seen across the Arab Muslim world how citizens have actually taken control of their own destiny in terms of making that happen. And I think that there is fear in the north about what comes next. There are no easy solutions. The economic situation is dire. They're dependent upon the South for oil. And so I see, reactions out of fear, anxiety, uncertainty that is going to have to play itself out. But in the meantime, I think the international community has an absolute responsibility to try its best to provide UN troops with a strong mandate and try to protect civilians, and certainly to say that things like what have happened in Abyei and the Nuba Mountains recently are absolutely unacceptable and intolerable.
Egbert Wesselink, it would appear from what we are talking about is that outside forces have an immense responsibility, particularly the West, which has, with almost unseemly haste, brought about the Republic's independence. What do you think can be done by these outside forces that isn't being done at present?
Well, there's one thing I'm really extremely worried about, almost panicking, which is what will happen in the Nuba Mountains in southern Kordofan in the north when the dry season comes. There's aerial bombing going on every day. People are actually killed now. There are 30,000 troops, Nuba troops, experienced soldiers, who've prepared for this war over the past 6 years. And the northern government has amassed an enormous amount of troops and militias and anything you have around the Nuba Mountains. And I'm afraid we will see a terrible war. Don't forget, the Nuba Mountains lost, they went from 1.2 million inhabitants to about 600,000 in the 1990s. This was such a horrible war. And I'm afraid we are going to see a part two of it. And what I do not see from the international community is enough panic about this. And I think we should seriously consider to put European Union, for instance, to put some serious economic sanctions on the NCP and to challenge the NCP, saying you will not survive if you're going to exterminate the Nuba, which I'm afraid is going to happen this autumn.
Richard Dowden, threat of sanction, do you think this is necessary?
Well, I would certainly say yes. I would, if you have the UN troops, the Ethiopians there, and also to offer some protection to the Nuba Mountains, you've got to have a no-fly zone, and that is very expensive to do. But I think if the outside, the rest of the world is serious about protecting these people, and the North has already shown its intention by declaring Southerners non-citizens in the North, so all those refugees are now stateless. That's the sort of attitude that they have. I think it'll need an awful lot of pressure on Khartoum. But you've got a president there who is under indictment for the International Criminal Court. So are many of his senior people, and they've got nothing to lose. And I think the only thing, would be if the African Union, China, other states also put pressure on them, would be the only way of getting them to actually come to with clean hands, with open hands to a negotiating table and make a deal and stick to it and allow these to be settled peacefully.
Well, Jackie Wilson, there's been a somewhat gloomy prognosis on this day of celebration and the birth of a new nation. But do you think that civic society that you mentioned can be strong enough, can be viable enough, and can have the will to actually surmount all these immense obstacles that we've been talking about?
Well, it's certainly an uphill battle, but I have worked with and met many committed, intelligent, civil society activists and people who are working on all manner of these issues in terms of education, in terms of trying to hold their governments accountable, in terms of challenging the process of developing a constitution to try to make sure that it's more inclusive. And they face an uphill battle, but yes, I believe, particularly with the support of the international community, which I think we will see a robust effort to support the new Republic of South Sudan. And I think it's essential that is not just an international infusion, but actually a collaboration and a process of mentoring, coaching, working side by side with these young Sudanese organizations and entities.
Well, on that hope, that brings us to the end. Thanks to our guests, Richard Dowden, Jackie Wilson, and Egbert Wesselink. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.